On this episode of Newt's World, Frank Meyer devised the blueprint for American conservatism, fusionism championed by Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, and so many to this day. Yet, earlier in his life, communists in London chanted, "Free Frank Meyer," to block the deportation of a comrade who was their cause célèbre. Those fervent Marxists could never have predicted that their hero would one day provide the intellectual energy necessary to propel conservatives into political power. The Man Who Invented Conservatism unveils one of the 20th century's great untold stories. A communist turned conservative, an anti-war activist turned soldier, and a free love enthusiast turned family man whose big idea captured the American right. Here to discuss Frank Meyer's life, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Daniel Flynn, a senior editor of the American Spectator, serves as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution for the 2024-2025 academic year, and is the author of 7 books. Dan, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you for having me.
What attracted you to dig into Frank Meyer's life?
I think a lot of people are attracted to write about figures like Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill that everybody knows. I'm the opposite. I want to write about somebody that I think people should know about but don't. And Frank had one of those stories that, as you put it in the introduction, it was one of the great untold stories of the 20th century. And so the idea of telling this exciting story, the way I look at it, the early conservative movement or ideologues in general, there are a lot of them that live kind of black and white, dull lives. That's most of them. I think there's a few that operated in Technicolor. Whittaker Chambers, Wilmore Kendall would be examples of that. Frank Meyer lived in 3D. He really pops off the page. So as a biographer, he did a lot of the heavy lifting for me just in the way that he lived his life.
Before you decided to do the book, had you been aware of and influenced by Frank Meyer?
I had read In Defense of Freedom. I think for young conservatives coming up, that's one of those kind of maybe a dozen canonical books of which you'd have to have read 8 of them to kind of have entry into serious conversations with other serious conservatives. So I'd certainly read In Defense of Freedom. I don't think I called myself a fusionist or thought a whole lot about Frank Meyer. And in fact, my prejudice coming in is I don't want to write about one of these ideologues. I want to write about someone exciting. I had written about Jim Jones and Harvey Milk in a previous book. I wrote about Eric Hoffer, who really was an exciting character. Various figures on the American left, like Julius Wayland, John Reed. I thought those were exciting guys. And I thought, well, gee, Frank Meyer, he's boring. Well, he was the furthest thing from boring.
So in a sense, you approach this as a professional biographer.
Yes, not as a Meyerite or a fusionist or anything like that, but just someone that wanted to tell an interesting story. And as I say, Frank lived an interesting story, so that made my job a lot easier.
Part of what strikes me in Meyer's life is that he had a permanent sense of passion, although it shifted radically from being a passion for communism to being a passion for conservatism. But would you agree that there was something at the core of his being that required passion in order to have fully lived his life?
I think so, and I think people want to be around passion. Very early on, I see a letter that I found that is saying to Frank, this is from a prep school teacher in Pennsylvania, saying to Frank, I miss our scintillating conversations. Frank's back at Oxford. He's in Pennsylvania. I want to go drinking with you. You're so exciting when you give toasts and you drink. And I want to do a cook's tour of this part of the country with you. And all these books that you recommended, I want to read them. And just went on and on. That letter was written by James Michener. And that to me was very common, that Frank had all of these friends. This is a guy 15, 20 years before he wrote Tales of the South Pacific, which is one of the most famous books that became one of the most famous plays in American history. And here he is as a prep school teacher, basically begging Frank Meyer to be his friend. So when you say passion, people exude passion. Well, other people want to be around that guy. In Great Britain, Frank was the Johnny Appleseed of the communist movement amongst the youth. When I looked at MI5 and MI6 declassified material, they repeatedly identify him as the founder of the Student Communist Party movement in Great Britain. And here's this guy that does this in England, that is the Johnny Appleseed of communism amongst the universities in England. He comes over to America and essentially does the same thing for conservatives.
Let me start with his background. What do you think there was in his childhood and his early youth that led him, first of all, to be so passionately communist?
Well, his mother was very active in Judaism, and his father was a capitalist. And at about 16, Frank rebelled against both of those things, religion and capitalism. When he gets to the United Kingdom, he kind of styles himself a revolutionary, and he found something called the October Club, which is a club that still exists in Oxford to this day. And Frank gets to Oxford. There are 0 communists at Oxford. By the time he leaves, there's 300. Frank, in his youth, his parents had him when they were both around 40 years old. He comes into the world, into a family in which the parents think the prospect of them having no kids is very real. So he's not only an only child, but he might not exist. So he's very valued from day one. He grows up very wealthy in kind of a high-hat hotel in Newark, New Jersey. He goes to a fancy prep school. When he's 16, he meets his best friend at Belgrade Lakes, the inspiration for On Golden Pond. And his best friend is Eugene O'Neill Jr. And he meets Eugene O'Neill, the greatest American playwright. And at 16, he's bumming a copy of Tristram Shandy off of Eugene O'Neill. They're talking in 1926 about the prospects of war between the United States and Japan. They're playing kind of a Marco Polo meets Risk game in the water at Belgrade Lakes. So he's very comfortable around a guy that at that point had already written 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning plays. When he meets Meyer, he's writing his 3rd in Strange Interlude. And so Meyer, at 16, to have that comfort level with the famous, the intelligent, the smart people like Gene O'Neill, there was a great confidence bordering on sort of an arrogance in Frank Meyer. And I think that's part of the reason that he was able to convince as many people to come over to his side when he got to Oxford.
He's a passionate advocate of whatever it is he's passionately advocating.
Yes, and when he's at Oxford, one of the things he's passionate about, as a lot of some are, is women. And as he is advocating the violent overthrow of the government of Ramsay MacDonald, what I found in these papers is that he was secretly dating the youngest daughter of Ramsay MacDonald. I have a letter from Sheila MacDonald, his youngest daughter, and Ramsay MacDonald was a widow. And she says, listen, the coast is clear, my dad's not around. Come over to 10 Downing Street, we'll have dinner. Think about any romantic figure in the history of communism that you can come up with. Che Guevara, John Reed. There is nobody that had the stones to pull off something like that you were calling for the violent removal of the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and at the same time, you were secretly dating his daughter. Well, he wasn't long for Great Britain. I have about 160 pages of MI5 and MI6 declassified notes on Meyer. They knew where he did his banking. They knew where he drank. They did a black bag job on his apartment. They did put a mail cover on his correspondence. But we're supposed to believe that they didn't realize that he was dating their big boss's daughter, that he was dating Ramsay MacDonald's daughter. I find that hard to believe. What I know is true and what I know is concrete is that there were moves in the spring and late winter of 1934 to deport Frank Meyer. And this brings in people like Clement Attlee, who becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He gives a speech in Meyer's defense on the floor of Parliament. There's a petition that goes around with E.M. Forster, who wrote Passage to India, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, the Dean of Canterbury. They're all signing a petition, keep Frank Meyer in this country. There are petitions, there are rallies, there are dances, there were fundraisers held for Frank Meyer. And ultimately, this is a battle he loses. Michael Straight, who later was the publisher of the New Republic and much later was revealed as a communist spy, he remembers as a teenager marching around London with other student activists chanting, "Free Frank Meyer, free Frank Meyer." And in June of 1934, they couldn't free him. They kicked him out of the country. He went to work as a peace activist under a guy whose name you probably remember, Walter Ulbricht, who was the longest-serving dictator of East Germany. Imagine that, a guy who had already ordered the murder of policemen in Germany. Meyer is working under him to promote peace. Meyer, in 1962, he was giving speeches on American college campuses saying, "Mr. Khrushchev, tear down this wall." That's 25 years before Reagan was doing it. Here he was in 1934, working for the guy who would later erect the Berlin Wall. So we talk about a long, strange trip. Frank Meyer certainly had a long, strange trip, and it started in the 1920s and 1930s as a Stalinist.
Now, when he works for Ulbricht, is he working for Ulbricht in Germany?
No, he's working in France because Ulbricht at that time was already wanted or suspected for murdering these two policemen. And by 1934, Hitler already has powers. So the leading communists had already kind of skedaddled. I believe during the Second World War, Ulbricht was safe and sound in Moscow. But at this point, he's in Paris.
What happens to Meyer? I mean, here he is. He's a internationally known celebrity among communists. And then something happens. What happened?
Well, he goes to the United States, and in the United States, he's a communist for like 10 years. In Britain, he's on the board of the Communist Party of Great Britain. He's the director of the Student Bureau. He's a big deal in Britain. In the United States, he's something like a mid-level manager. I mean, he becomes the director of the Chicago Workers' School. He's kind of a big deal, but he's not at that higher echelon in the party that he was in Great Britain until the very end. And so a couple of years prior to the end of World War II, Meyer gets in the ear of Earl Browder, who was the head of the Communist Party of the United States. And he sends him a letter. He's frustrated. And he said, listen, if we want to attract bowlers instead of these hardcore Marxists, we need to fuse the American tradition with Marxism. And we need to do this not just on the 4th of July. We need to do this every day of the year. Earl Browder went in that direction. The party went in that direction. Whether Meyer was the one who convinced him or not, I mean, that's just speculation. But Browder went in that direction. And so Meyer had been the director of the Chicago Workers' School. After he was teaching at something called the Jefferson School. Browder was the general secretary of the party. Now he was the president. They used to sing the International when they started their meetings. Now they sing the Star-Spangled Banner. So they try to wrap up communism and the American flag. And that keeps Meyer in the party. But in 1945, there comes from France something called the Duclos letter, which Meyer and Browder and other communists interpreted as some guy from France lecturing Americans on how to run the party, basically saying you can't be buddy-buddy with capitalists anymore, you can't support Roosevelt, there's going to be a Cold War coming between the United States and the Soviet Union, you better shape up and get on board and stop with this all-American communism stuff. And Meyer and Browder are naive, and they think, well, this is just this French goofball writing us this letter. No, it was the Kremlin, it was Stalin telling them and warning them, in not an overt way, in a covert way, the Cold War is coming. This temporary alliance that you have with Roosevelt in the United States, that's ending. Stop that. Meyer and Browder didn't want to do that. The party dumps Browder, and they make a villain of him. And Frank Meyer kind of slinks out of the party. But before he does that, he comes upon a book called The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, a guy he had known at the London School of Economics. They both were Rockefeller-funded scholars there. And he reads this book, and even as a communist, it blows him away. He writes a review of it. It's not a positive review. It's kind of a mixed positive review in a publication called The New Masses, which was communist-controlled. And at that time, that's about the only time in the history of the Communist Party that you can write a positive review of a right-wing book, of a conservative book, of a free market book. That book, The Road to Serfdom, you can almost see his brain changing when he reviews the book in The New Masses, that he realizes that communism wasn't all it's cracked up to be. It was not democratic. What was really democratic is the idea of freedom, of having the freedom to choose what you wanted and not having it driven down your throat by communist direct market controlled by a few people. And so both the Duclos letter and The Road to Serfdom encourages Meyer to leave the Communist Party. He does that in 1945. He takes a break. By 1950, when you read what he's writing, it's clear that he has all the language of a right-winger. He is a conservative by that point, and the change had been complete by 1950.
Having been as deep inside as you could in the Western communist movement, he writes, communist theory is powerful not because it is true, most obviously it is not. It is powerful because it is believed.
Yes, and he started not believing it. And the first crack in his armor, he had sent men to their deaths as a recruiter for the Spanish Civil War. One of the men that he brought into the Communist Party, or boys that he brought, was a guy named John Cornford, who was the great-grandson of Charles Darwin. Cornford became the model icon of the UK communist left. Meyer set him up as a successor. And when Meyer left, he became the head of the Communist Party of the university students in Great Britain. Quatford dies in Spain the day after his 21st birthday. And Meyer feels great guilt for this, tries to join up World War II. And the communists are exhorting everyone to join up and fight Hitler. And when Meyer tries to join, they say, no, you can't go. And Meyer's confused. Well, you're telling everyone to go and fight Hitler. I want to fight Hitler. And they say, no, you can't go. And so they have a big fight. Finally, they let Meyer go. And when he joins the military, he joins the army, he realizes the men in his squad bay are not the proletariat that Marx had told him about. This is a guy that lived in a lot of social insulation. He was very wealthy, and he's meeting plumbers and electricians for the first time, guys that work on assembly lines, and he realized that what Marx had told him about the working class was a complete lie. So there were a number of things that led up to his departure from the Communist Party, his defection, and of course, it all ends up with him testifying at the longest, most expensive trial in the history of the United States up until that point, which was the Smith Act trial of 1949. Meyer was called a star witness, a mystery witness, and he helped send Gus Hall, Eugene Dennis, a lot of the leaders of the Communist Party, 11 leaders of the Communist Party. He helped send them to federal prison for 5 years.
How did that transition occur? I mean, did the FBI recruit him or what?
Meyer was friends in the party with a guy named Louis Budens. Louis Budens was ultimately, he defects in a much more colorful way than Meyer does. Meyer was a very colorful character, but at Meyer's defection, he kind of slinked out of the party. It was very nondescript. Louis Budens did something unprecedented in the history of the Communist Party. Him and Meyer for years were talking about Americanizing the party, and Meyer had some success in doing that. And so when he left the party, he tips Meyer off, I'm leaving. And Meyer doesn't rat him out. Meyer remains his friend, which is unusual for someone in the party. But Louis Budens at this point is the editor of the Daily Worker. And on the same day that he leaves the party, he is on the masthead as the managing editor of the Daily Worker. The most famous Catholic priest in the United States, Fulton Sheen, converts him to Catholicism in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it's in every newspaper in the country. But James Young of the Daily Worker just converted to Catholicism, and now he's an anti-communist. Meyer didn't leave like that. But Budens, a few years later, in 1947, he says, Meyer, listen, there's some guys I want you to talk to. They're FBI agents. You don't have anything to worry about. Let them come up. So over the course of a month in 1947, every week the FBI came to visit Frank Meyer. And he told his wife that he realized at that moment what grace meant, because there was no good choice open to him. He could either betray his old comrades, he could betray his friends, or he could betray his country. And what he decided to do after much agony was to go with his country over his friends, or as I think Aristotle put it, I love truth and I love Plato, but if these things are in conflict, I'm going to pick truth over my friends. And I think essentially that's what Frank Meyer did in testifying. And Louis Budens, who was one of the most prolific witnesses against the Communist Party, he's really the guy that convinced Meyer to testify against his old comrades.
At that point, I mean, he clearly has decisively in his own head broken with who he once was.
Yes, he did. And the hard thing about that is he had, prior to defecting, he moved to, of all places, Woodstock, New York. Now, later, Bob Dylan would move in next door. You'd have members of the band live down the street. Van Morrison lived down the street. Frank Meyer's the last person on earth to care about any of this. But even in the 1940s, this was an artist colony. This was a place where leftists from Greenwich Village retreated to. And Frank chose that as a place to live. And all sorts of people that had been his friends were all of a sudden no longer his friends. You take a guy like Philip Guston. A few years ago, one of his paintings went for $26 million. Well, when Frank knew him in Woodstock, he was a starving artist. But the moment Frank goes over to the other side, becomes a conservative, Guston won't have anything to do with him. And there are a lot of people in Woodstock that Frank becomes a pariah to. So he's living isolated up on this hill in Woodstock. He starts changing his hours. Frank becomes a nocturnal creature. He buys a gun. I think not without reason. He is worried about the prospect of the Communist Party exacting retribution. The party obviously had killed a lot of people. They didn't kill a lot of Americans, but they had killed some Americans. And I think Frank, with some justification, bought this gun. And for the last quarter century of his life, one of the things that identified Frank Meyer was this was a guy that got up in the afternoon and he slept till 7 a.m. And these were his hours for the rest of his life.
The way that he operated, from your perspective, Is he just comfortable being alone?
Well, he's with his wife, and he has two kids. I mean, one of his kids, your listeners probably know Eugene Meyer. Eugene Meyer was longtime president of the Federalist Society, and his other son, John, both of them extremely successful chess players, guys who graduated from Yale, very bright guys, and also guys that cooperated a great deal with this book. So he has his two kids. He has his wife. He's kind of a strange hermit. He's living isolated up on this hill in Woodstock, up on this mountain in Woodstock. And in fact, when Bob Dylan moved next door to him, Dylan's whole reason for moving there was he was fed up with the hippies. He wanted to go someplace where people couldn't find him. And the best place he could think of was Ohio Mountain Road in Woodstock. So he moves back next to Meyer, but the properties touch, but they're basically like a quarter mile away. They're houses, but their properties are touching. And so Meyer moves to a place where people really can't find him. Yet he is a social animal. And he starts to do something after he leaves the Communist Party, which is to make phone calls. And I have his tax returns from 1940 to 1972. So his phone calls become so legendary that by the early 1960s, he's spending about a quarter of his income on telephone bills. And he's calling people. I interviewed a lot of people, and they talked about him calling at all times of the night. And of course, he did do that. You'd get a call from Frank Meyer maybe at 2 a.m. or midnight. One of his kids emailed me last night, said, well, that wasn't all that common. So maybe those people were remembering the unusual rather than the quotidian. But he did call people in all hours of the night. And people told me, well, it wasn't unusual for him to have multi-hour-long conversations with people. So he was a strange social animal that he was living isolated on this mountain in Woodstock, New York. But at the same time, he created that social connection. And the way he did that was from the telephone. The Ayatollah Khomeini, he had his revolution through cassette tapes. You had the people in Egypt, they did it through Twitter. Frank Meyer's revolution was done through AT&T.
That's wild. Now, he creates a fusion. Walk us through what that means, because Reagan cites him for that.
He certainly did. And I think if fusionism was so influential that even people that had never heard of the word fusionism, fusionists, even people that hadn't heard of Frank Meyer's name were effectively Meyerites. And basically what fusionism was a marriage of traditionalism and freedom. And Meyer essentially said that, listen, if you're a conservative in Great Britain, maybe you're conserving the royalty or the aristocracy. If you're conservative in Italy, maybe you're conserving the Catholic Church. If you're conservative in America, the tradition that you conserve is the American founding, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, maybe Washington's farewell address, a whole lot of other things. As one of Frank's acolytes, Stan Evans, put it on the cover of a book, the theme is freedom. And I think what Stan meant in his book is that you had thousands of years of Western civilization propping up this liberty that we enjoy in the United States. And if you take away our heritage, if you take away that tradition, you will not have freedom. And so there was this tension between tradition and virtue on the one hand and freedom on the other. And if you take one away, the other is meaningless, because flip the coin there. If you think about it, if you have compulsory virtue, that's not virtue at all. You have to have free choice to have true virtue. So this is fusionism in a nutshell, the marriage of traditionalism and freedom. And I think the reason it worked is, one, because at its base distilled level, it's essentially true, that it's easy to understand, and three, that it had utilitarian applications for politics. I mean, if you read a book like The Conservative Mind, which is a beautiful book by Russell Kirk, there's not a lot of political applications there. It might train you how to think. It might give you an appreciation for history, but it doesn't have a lot of political applications. I think the reason why In Defense of Freedom worked as a book and fusionism worked as a philosophy was because it did have political applications.
To what extent do you think Reagan became a Meyerite?
I think that Reagan was the embodiment of Frank Meyer's political dreams. In 1960, Reagan successfully coerced the editors of National Review not to endorse Richard Nixon. He viewed Nixon as an opportunist, and he said, why don't we just symbolically endorse Goldwater? We know he's not running for president, but let's just symbolically endorse him and put all our efforts into electing good conservatives at the congressional level. It may take, and it's probably going to take 20 years before we elect one of our own president of the United States. It's going to take until 1980. And of course, he was prophetic about that. immediately after Barry Goldwater, and even before Barry Goldwater loses in 1964, Meyer's eyes get diverted to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, of course, gave that great speech, which was kind of an infomercial for Goldwater. And I think Meyer, like a lot of people, thought, why isn't this guy running for president rather than this cranky guy over here, this London guy with the bolo tie? Why don't we have this guy running for president? And so Meyer became associated with Ronald Reagan, so much so that in 1968, when the New Republic asked various prominent figures to write about what candidate they were supporting, they naturally picked Meyer as the guy to write about Ronald Reagan, that his association as an intellectual was at least connected with him. And this had costs for Meyer. One of the things Meyer did at National Review was he was the literary editor of National Review. He was the person who essentially discovered Joan Didion. Noel Parmental, her boyfriend, was pushing her to all these editors around New York, and no one would take her. And Didion credits Meyer as the first editor to publish her freelance work. He was really a mentor to Joan Didion. He had a guy named Theodore Sturgeon, who ultimately became a writer for Star Trek, came up with Live Long and Prosper, is the guy that came up with the Prime Directive in Star Trek, wrote the episode where Leonard Nimoy invented that split-fingered salute that I can't do, but many people can, split their fingers down the middle. So he had that guy writing reviews of science fiction for National Review. Hugh Kenner, Guy Davenport, Gary Wills, all these literary heavy hitters he had reviewing books and making it really the best book review section in the United States. Now, by the time he's pushing Reagan, Hugh Kenner writes a critical piece on Reagan in National Review, sort of mocking the idea that he would be president. Meyer, who was great friends with Kenner, engineered behind the scenes a rebuttal that was written by Jeffrey Hart and caused Hugh Kenner to resign from National Review. So Kenner was best friends with a guy named Guy Davenport, and Guy Davenport writes him and says, listen, Hugh, Frank Meyer thinks that Ronald Reagan should be president of the USA, and he puts a bunch of exclamation points, because at that point, the idea of anyone supporting Ronald Reagan as president, they're thinking him as a movie actor. Frank is clearly thinking him as president of the United States, and he loses arguably his best book reviewer, Hugh Kenner, who resigns from the magazine because Meyer engineered this takedown of his criticism of Reagan. So Meyer very early on was a Reagan supporter. And of course, if you look at Reagan's speech at 1981 at CPAC, which, by the way, Meyer came up with the idea for CPAC in the 1960s. He was a founder of the American Conservative Union. He kept pushing the idea of this conference that would sort of marry activism and the intellectual right. Well, they didn't do it at the time, but they later created CPAC. And I think Meyer should be credited as a founding father of it. In 81, Reagan is sort of giving a hat tip to James Burnham and William F. Buckley and Russell Kirk, but he stops for an extraordinary long time talking about Frank Meyer and how he had paved the way for this moment. And I think more than any of those thinkers on the post-war conservative right, you have to look at Frank Meyer as someone who intellectually is most simpatico with the Reagan Revolution.
When you think of it in that context, Meyer is a quintessential intellectual. I mean, his impact is about ideas and about writing. And one of the things that really makes your book come alive is you actually found a whole bunch of letters. Can you walk us through that?
My plan was to read a bunch of books, read old issues of National Review, and then I would know what questions to ask when I interview people. I probably did about 100 interviews. I would know where to look when I would go into archives. But something happened in 2020 that your listeners probably remember. COVID shut everything down, particularly universities. They shut down for several years. So I couldn't do any archival work. I did a Freedom of Information Act request from the federal government in 2021. They came back to me in 2022 and they said, well, we're now processing requests from 2014, but your request, because it comes after COVID, it's going to take a little bit longer. In other words, come back to us in the 2030s. That's the efficiency of the National Archives. And when I looked at his papers at the Hoover Institution, I'm a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. I love going out there. I love their archives. Their archives was a tremendous help for this book. But when I looked at Meyer's papers out there, I noticed something was missing. I've been doing archival work for about 25 years, and the rhythm was off. So I out of desperation, I wished his papers into existence. I started calling people and saying, where's Frank's papers? And I got material that was helpful for private collections, letters, some property deeds, things like that. But I still didn't have his papers. And at a certain point, John Meyer, about a year and a half into the search, he said, well, we did sell the house to this couple, David Zinkavage and Karen Myers, and they bought all the contents. So I said, well, you should have told me about these people at first. I went to Zinkavage and Myers and said, you have Frank's papers? And they said, no, we donated them, or at least David did. And I said, no, you kept some of them. And they said, no, we don't. And I said, no, you don't. No, you didn't do it on purpose, but you kept some of them. You just don't know it. And this went on for a period of months. And finally they said, well, we have a warehouse. And they said, but there's 1,000 boxes and there's nothing in there. And even if there was something in there, you couldn't go through all 1,000 of the boxes. I said, yes, I could. Take me to your warehouse. So in August of 2022, I drove at 4 a.m. to Altoona, Pennsylvania. I went through 663 boxes. And therein, I found 15 large moving boxes that contained the papers of Frank Meyer. There's probably over 100,000 letters there. There's letters from Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Joan Didion, William F. Buckley. There's 1,000 letters from Wilmer Kendall, 1,000 letters from Frank Bazell, letters from J. Edgar Hoover. There's a lot of letters from Barry Goldwater. And for the most part, these are letters that nobody has ever seen before, or at least they haven't been seen since sender and receiver. I just read a piece on Leo Strauss's back and forth with Frank Meyer. That's completely fascinating. And these are letters that don't exist in Strauss's papers. So there's so many famous figures. I just did a piece for the Journal of Libertarian Studies. It didn't make it into the book, but a lot of things that was important that didn't make it in the book. But here is Murray Rothbard, one of the leading figures of libertarianism, talking about Ayn Rand in real time when he's a member of her inner circle and complaining about her, saying she's crazy or saying she's brilliant. And so I was able to write an article based on that. But really what this did, obviously, was allow me to tell Frank Meyer's story in his own words. I mean, the idea that you have the sycophantic letter from James Michener, or these love letters of sorts from Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald's daughter, other women, I find out that Meyer loses his virginity to one of the great women in American art in the 20th century. Dorothy Canning Miller, for the longest time, was the curator of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There's all sorts of love letters in there. There's all sorts of friendships. And really what it is, I think the book, a guy named Robert Dean Laurie in the Spectator world, the UK Spectator, just wrote a review that came out today. And I was blown over by it because he really got the book. He said, this book, it's really about friendships. It's really about why we fall in love with people and why we fall out of love with people. And surely you get that with Frank Meyer and Gary Wills. Gary Wills goes in the opposite direction. Frank Meyer mentors him. Wills says he spent more time with Meyer than anyone outside of his family in the late 50s and early 60s. But by the early 1970s, he's a left-winger. He goes in the opposite direction of Meyer. So they have this falling out. Wilmer Kendall, who's a guy who was the mentor of Bill Buckley, was an early National Review senior editor. It's real behind-the-scenes stuff that you're getting from these letters that you wouldn't get anywhere else. And then, of course, you see Kendall falling out with Meyer, falling out with Bill Buckley. At a certain point, L.C. Meyer says, quit fighting with all your friends to Wilmer Kendall, who was a notoriously difficult man. And he says, I don't know of any friend I'm in a fight with now except Frank S. Meyer. If you're talking about William F. Buckley, and he was William F. Buckley's teacher, he was his mentor. He says, if you're talking about William F. Buckley, nobody has heard me call him a friend in at least 5 years. He is not my friend. He is my enemy. So this is high drama stuff that you get in these letters that you're not going to get in any other book because there's no other scholar that has access to, I don't know, there's probably 100,000 letters that I have here, all sitting around my desk, by the way, covering my house for the last 3 years. And I think that's part of the reason why this is an exciting book, because it is so original. It has so much stuff that came from this warehouse that nobody has had access to.
Given this, how much you've immersed yourself in him, if Meyer were alive today, how do you think he would view the current conservative movement?
That's a very interesting question. On the one hand, Meyer was decidedly not a populist. In some ways, without admitting it, I mean, he was a big fan of Joe McCarthy. And when James Buckley ran for Senate in 1970, he was an advisor to him. And his advice to Buckley was really populist. He said, listen, you got to reach out to these blue-collar Democrats. You can't win in New York in a three-way race. Even, as a Republican, even in a three-way race, you've got to reach out to these union people, get union votes, get blue-collar votes. So in some ways, he'd be fine with it, but he was not a populist. I think the one way in which he would fit in with what Trump is doing, what the MAGA people are doing, is on foreign policy. And that seems very peculiar because Meyer is a guy who at one point was talking about a preemptive nuclear strike of the Soviet Union. I mean, he is someone who was a Cold Warrior down to the bone. He hated communism because he was a communist. I mean, the guy who brought him to sign up as a member of the Communist Party in Great Britain, a guy named Prince Mirsky, he dies in a gulag by the end of that decade. Meyer has friends that get killed. Meyer has friends who murdered people. He knows how evil communism is. So he was very supportive of an active U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. Henry Kissinger writes him a letter in 1968. Kissinger says, and this is one of the letters in the collection, Kissinger says, listen, I'm going to be the national security advisor under Richard Nixon. And so he asked him, what should I do? What should we do with foreign policy? And Meyer says, well, of course, there's this messianic crusader state that is an existential threat to the United States and a lot of other nations in the world. So our main should be to stop them, to roll them back, to defeat them. However, absent this messianic crusader state, if there's a world in which they no longer exist, of course, the idea of the United Nations, the idea of foreign aid, the idea of all these entangling alliances, they would be farcical. Even the idea of the Vietnam War would be a complete farce if there were no Soviet Union. It would be no business of ours what the social system of any other nation would be if it were not for communism trying to take over this world. You think about today, think about how brutal Russia has been with Ukraine, and they take over, 20% of Ukraine, and people justifiably think that this is madness and this guy is a sort of a holdover from the KGB. It's 20% of one country. You come out of World War II and they take over 12 countries or something like that, Europe? And so the guy that Meyer was, obsessed with in those days, Stalin or his successors, they were really doing bad business all around the world. And of course, he wanted to stop that. But he saw a world in which they didn't exist. And he thought in that world, it doesn't make sense to manage the social systems and make sure that every country was sort of a democracy like we are. And he said this explicitly in a debate with Alan Lowenstein at Yale. He said this with Kissinger, and he said this in his last column in National Review, which he wrote in December 1971. And at that point, he didn't know it, but the cancer that he got, and he was a chain smoker like a lot of these guys. They really lived madmen existence back then. The cancer that was eating away at him, the last column he writes in National Review, it is a view of the world without the Soviet Union and what our foreign policy would be. And so in that sense, I think he would be very comfortable with the Trump people. I think on trade, sort of the more populist aspect of it, on the bigger government aspect of it, I think he'd be horrified.
What's your next project?
Well, I don't know. There was a guy that I was writing about here, and I used to call him my oldest friend because I met him when he was 96 years old. And his name was Noel Parmetel. He was the boyfriend of Joan Didion for 6 years, and I interviewed him a series of times. And I thought, wow, this guy is one of the more interesting guys that I've ever come across. And he had a bit of a con man in him, but like a lot of con men, he was very charming. And so I think about reading about him, maybe in a long-form article. I don't know that people will go for a book, but that's what I'm thinking about. I'm also thinking about some of these early National Review people. In the first 7 years of the publication, there were these three amigos, these three musketeers, Frank Meyer, Brent Bozell, and Wilmer Kendall. And they were sort of National Review's right wing. When Meyer came in there was a guy named Willy Schlamm. He's the idea man behind National Review. He came up with the idea. Schlamm was a communist who had met Lenin at 16, turned like Meyer did, became an anti-communist conservative in the post-war year, and his idea was National Review. Bill Buckley did the heavy lifting. He executed the idea, did the fundraising. But early on, Schlamm was sort of the leader of the right wing in National Review. He gets defenestrated because he's a big pain in the neck, and everyone thinks he's a pain in the neck. And so Meyer takes over his role not only as book review editor, but as sort of the anti-James Burnham in National Review. James Burnham was an anti-communist, but I don't know if I said it or someone else said it, but his conservatism essentially stopped at the water's edge. And so Meyer was the leader of National Review's right-wing faction. And people like Meyer, Wilmer Kendall, Brent Bozell, to a certain degree, they were living, if you've ever seen the show Mad Men, they were living sort of a Mad Men existence. Kendall writes Meyer a letter at one point saying, listen, I'm kind of on a health kick. My normal intake of 70 cigarettes a day I'm now down to a pack. I think nowadays you look at a guy like Wilmer Pennell and say, well, he had personality disorder. And Meyer is up in Woodstock, sort of leading the battle of National Review's right wing. He loses the battle within National Review, but he wins the broader war for the conservative movement. In other words, National Review increasingly takes on the look of what James Burnham wanted for it, which is sort of an opinion, a regular opinion magazine. Meyer is like a philosophical journal. So he loses that battle in National Review, but this right wing in National Review, they win the broader battle for the soul of the conservative movement. So I'm interested in that as well.
It's amazing. I want to thank you for joining me. I'm frankly amazed both by your own career and the range of people you've written about, and by your new book, which I think is really badly needed. The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. It's available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I want to let our listeners know they can find out more about the work you're doing by visiting the American Spectator website at spectator.org. And I really appreciate you sharing. This has been fascinating.
This is a privilege to talk to you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you to my guest, Daniel J. Flynn. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.